Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. A few months ago, Nigeria closed all its land borders to tackle smuggling. What prompted the move? Mainly rice and the smuggling of petrol. The fall in supply of rice has led to food price inflation, which has impacted strongly on consumers. The question now is, do rice farmers here in Nigeria have the capacity to cater and make available this all-important food staple? Joining us now to discuss the economics of rice production in Nigeria is the chairman of the Agribusiness Trade Group of the Nigerian Association of Chamber of Commerce, Industry, Mines and Agriculture, NASIMA. He is also Vice President, Corporate and Government Relations, ULAM Nigeria Limited, which is one of Nigeria's leading food and agribusiness companies. What, about $16 billion, I guess? Yes. Ade Adefeko, welcome to the morning show.
Good morning.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
Yes, you're welcome. Well, let's start from the basics. I mean, the Nigerian government decided to shut down its land borders because it wants to boost agriculture, encourage local productivity, protect its market and, specific strategic sectors, and also at the same time check smuggling of petroleum products, and also check the smuggling into Nigeria of small arms and weapons, which tend to come through the borders. Now, the government has been celebrating the achievement. The president himself said, smuggling of petroleum products have gone down by 30%. The Minister of Information told us that customs now, revenue per day has jumped from 4.2 billion naira per day to 8 billion naira. And so many other achievements have been defined. What, in your assessment, is the true situation? Have the objectives been met, or you think that the continued closure of the borders could be counterproductive in the long run?
Well, thank you very much. It's important to always look at sectors or issues from the standpoint of economics. There's an economics to everything. I usually talk about the economics of aviation, economics of telecommunication, economics of everything. So it's important to talk about the economics of the border closure. It's important to state, ab initio, that Nigeria's borders have been porous. People always talk about time immemorial. I will speak to time immemorial. But this government has taken a bold step in closing the borders sometime in August. Let me give you a quick instance, because I will speak to agriculture. I will speak to security just briefly, because I don't want to touch on areas that are not within my jurisdiction. I'm speaking here on the agricultural value chain and with respect to agriculture. But quickly, just look at this. 2.5 million tons of rice is smuggled every year from those borders we're talking about. Nigeria produces around about 7 million tons of rice. Consumes rather, not produces. Consumes around about 7 million tons of rice. We produce, sometimes, we're a nation that lacks statistics sometimes. And I was speaking to you offset, that in God I trust, every other thing is data. Data is important, because if you don't have data, you can't plan. You can only plan for people who you have data on. So 2.5 million tons of rice is smuggled in every year. We consume about 7 million tons. We produce around about between 2.5 million and 3.5 million, whoever you believe. But you need to understand that rice, the final product, which is rice that we consume, is not what you have in this tonnage we're talking about. Because rice itself is you have rice, a ton of paddy, for example, gives you the following, and I must state this, unequivocally. It gives you 60% packed rice, mixed brokens around about 6.5%, rejects around about 2.5%, bran around about 7%, and husk around about 24%. So the final product you come up with is around about 60% of what has been milled, okay? Because what you get out of paddy is finished product, which is rice. And paddy is what you farm. So going back to what I was speaking to, we are not self-sufficient. And we often kid ourselves, because prior to now, before the borders were closed, 2.5 million tons used to come in. And we used to factor that as local production, erroneously. But right now that the borders have been closed for the last around about 2-3 months, I think it's augured well for us. One, because rice comes in smuggled, duties are not paid. But right now, rice has been coming in rather, in trickles, smuggled as well, but very, very, very infinitesimally. And that, I think, is a good thing. But through those same borders, you have smuggled milk, you have smuggled... Everything, it looks like a country of anything goes. But I think the government has taken a bold step by looking at three things. They looked at it from a standpoint of security, which you find out that since around the borders, you have proliferation of small arms. That has stopped to a large extent. When last did you hear about any attack on any Boko Haram attack? Don't get me wrong. Maybe it's coincidental, maybe not. When last did you hear about tensions at the borders with respect to, looking at things from a point of view of, on the politics or the diplomatic side? Prior to now, anytime there was border closure, the president of Benin Republic usually comes to Nigeria and says, you know what, please take it easy on me. That happened with the president of Benin Republic visiting our president when he went to Japan. Okay? And I'm not quite sure whether he went to Sochi as well to see him. I'm talking about President Patrice Talon, who is a cotton farmer himself. He's often referred to as Patrice Coton. Patrice Coton means he used to deal in cotton, you see. So Benin Republic is population 11 million, okay? A huge quantum of rice comes in through their border from Thailand. They don't eat parboiled rice. We eat parboiled rice. So where's destination? Destination is Nigeria. So we've had local production bureau ramped up. Not ramped up as much as government is making us to believe, but again, there's been a concerted effort. And again, I must commend the Central Bank of Nigeria to an extent for intervening in the rice value chain, amongst others. But again, you need to have a more holistic approach rather than what you call ad hocism. What we have right now is what we call ad hocism. And that ad hocism can help us. We need to be more long-term. And we need to plan more, not based on electoral cycles, okay, or flows, 4 years, 8 years, but more long-term. And I'm talking about long-term now. For us to be able to attain self-sufficiency, we need to have what you call a holistic approach which involves rice millers, rice farmers, rice processors, because it's a value chain. You see, you often hear government tell you about we're establishing more mills. What do you put in the mills? It's paddy. So you need to have more rice farms, right, producing paddy, which goes into the mill. But right now, government is putting sometimes the cart before the horse, okay? If I have a rice mill and I don't have paddy to put into the mill, what is the essence? So for me, I think the border closure has been good. Government revenues have increased by 15%. So says Lai Mohammed. I believe him. He probably has the facts. Okay? But the customs head honcho must realize, and I think he does, that the job of customs is trade facilitation, not revenue generation. And sometimes when you're doing revenue generation, is an admixture of both. So what customs should do is to enhance and facilitate trade, okay? Not talking about the revenues they've generated to a large extent. And again, I think when smuggling happens, I'm speaking from my position as head of the Agribusiness Trade Group of NASIMA. What government must make scapegoats of customs officers who have been found to be aiding and abetting smugglers. I haven't seen that happen. And my members are saying, if you know that smugglers are deep in this, they must have someone or some collaborators. Expose those collaborators. Because, it's important for government to show the right signals. That, what we're doing here, we mean business. And I must commend, like I said again, the President and Commander-in-Chief and his entire, apparatchik for taking that bold decision of closing the borders. But again, that border closure should not be an end in itself.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned the entire aim of becoming self-sufficient in terms of production, because with current tax incentives for the rice value chain as a whole and loads of injections by companies like Olam, Dangote, Coscharas, etc., one would hope that that's what we're aiming to. But the situation that we're seeing here as well is that, okay, let's take outgrower schemes, for example. These are companies that have outgrower schemes for local farmers to try and boost production. But compared to Egypt, our yield is still 1.87 hectares, I believe, compared to Egypt's, which is at 8.27 per hectare. And this is a huge gap that we're seeing here. And the only change that can occur is with technology. So what sort of tech developments do we need to see to support that production side of the value chain and also support schemes like outgrower schemes for local farmers?
Very interesting perspective you bring in. Because you see, technology is an enabler. And we need to move away from talking about the fact that Nigeria has 84 million hectares of arable land and less than 1/3 of it is cultivated and all that and all that. Because, the world is a global village. Technology is moving. We have artificial intelligence. We have aerospatial technology. Look at my farm, for example. Let me just digress and come straight to Olam. Olam is the largest player in that space. In spite of our investment of almost $180 million in the rice value chain, we only supply 10% of Nigeria's rice needs. Why is that? Because growing or cultivating or farming rice is not a tea party. You have to clear the land, and we clear the land using technology, advanced technology to do that. We have 18,000 outgrowers. But right now, the outgrowers we have in the entire outgrower chain is less than 1 million. Okay? For a country of 200 million people, we need to do more. We need to invest in technology. You're talking about yield. Yield per hectare is very low in Nigeria. Not only in rice, but in many other crops. We are doing 5 because we're a large behemoth. But how many people can do 5? You're talking about Egypt doing 8. I was speaking to Ruben Offset yesterday that Nigeria is the second largest producer of onions in Africa. Egypt is the largest. But Egypt's yield on its onions is higher than Nigeria's yields on onions. Because for us, we've not adopted the latest technology. We're still very analogous in the way we do things. And we have refused to move into the digital age. And the digital age, the last time I checked, we're talking about the 4th industrial revolution. The train left the station a long time ago. It might come back. If we're lucky, we'll get in. If we're not, it's left.
Well, in a matter of seconds, we need to take a short break. But, how competitive, is Nigeria in the face of this border closure? It's not enough to just talk about money, about figures, about reduction in smuggling. Take our rice. The cost of producing paddy rice is still probably one of the highest in the world.
Yes.
Right? And then the local rice that we produce, how does it, compare with the same imported rice that we say we do not want? And what can we do to raise the level of competitiveness in order to be able to gain the advantage that we're looking for? But we'll take a short break. When we come back, you can respond to that. This is still the Morning Show here on the Arise News Channel. And we're talking to Ade Adefeko, Vice Chairman, Corporate and Government Relations of Olam Nigeria Limited and Chairman, Agribusiness Trade Group of NASIMA. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Morning Show here on the Arise News Channel. Still with us in our Lagos studio is Ade Adefeko, Vice Chairman, Corporate and Government Relations of Olam Nigeria Limited and Chairman of the Agribusiness Trade Group of NASIMA. Now, Ade, before we went on break, I'd asked you a question about competitiveness.
Yes.
And how competitive we are, what are the challenges, and what kind of advantage can we establish, considering the fact that, yes, there's rice production, demand outstrips supply, and many people are even saying the local rice, it contains stone, and it doesn't taste as well as imported parboiled rice from Thailand.
It contains stone.
Ruben,
or maybe sand, if you like.
Ruben, on a lighter note, I'll probably have a Thai massage than Thai rice. But again, that's off record. The current price of paddy in Nigeria, a Nigerian rice miller buys paddy around about between 135,000 to 140,000. That's about 70% higher than the major rice producing countries in the world. And for us, in order for us to be competitive with top rice producers, our millers need to be able to buy paddy in the range of between 100 and 150,000, which is why the Central Bank of Nigeria has come in with some refinancing schemes for millers and growers. Good thing. But another thing you must ask again is, these outgrowers...
You not recommend outright subsidy as they have in Southeast Asia.
I agree with you, but you see, production must be subsidized, not consumption. I've been an advocate of production subsidy rather than consumption subsidy. But we tend to a large extent, subsidize consumption here rather than production. But again, going back to what you said, data revealed, I told you that in God I trust, every other thing is data. Data recently revealed that the Republic of Benin, which is Nigeria's closest neighbor, with a population of, I said at the onset, that has about 11 million people, barely 5% of Nigeria's population, is the biggest buyer of rice from Thailand, which is the second largest exporter, probably after India. So official shipments from Thailand have dwindled right now to almost nothing. You know why? Because of our local production we're ramping up, border closures, because the rice is not coming in. But you see, what you have to understand is the economics of what I told you. These rice merchants who bring in rice from Thailand and through the border, they don't pay duties. So for them, there's no cost. The only cost is FOB, bring it, lands in Cotonou. Cotonou gets smuggled in at night. But someone like me, for example, who's the largest producer of rice in Nigeria, has to pay all kinds of costs. I have to buy paddy, cost of production, no power. So I'm technically speaking my own government. So I provide the roads, I provide the irrigation, I provide everything I need. These guys at the borders smuggle and it comes in. So there's no way they will not undermine me, which is where Central Bank of Nigeria has to come in to have what you call stabilization. And that stabilization is what speaks to what I told you. Let us fund that production. That production must be ramped up. But you see, that production can be ramped up by legislation. We often tend to over-legislate and talk about things that must be done. We want this, we want the price to be X, we want the price to be Y. I'm not an economist, but I did simple economics 101. If production is less than demand, there will be demand and supply variables. So you cannot fix the price. Right now, in the open market, since the border closure, prices have gone up 40%. So we're talking about 15,000 used to be the price. Right now it's about 22,000. And if we're not careful, when December, it could go up as high as 24, 26. That's, again, I think we need to understand and situate in context that rice is a political crop. You and I, again, were speaking offset yesterday. That in our days, those of us who are already on the 5th floor, we're talking about when we used to eat rice. We used to eat rice.
You're on the 5th floor. Yeah. You are so... oh, your beards have gone white.
Ruben,
you're on the 7th floor.
So I'm on the 5th floor, and I said to myself, Ruben, you and I were talking about, in our university days when we used to eat rice very, very sparingly. And used to eat rice on Christmas Day, Easter, and very, festive occasions. But rice is now a political crop. So everybody is going about rice. People have forgotten the fact that they can eat cocoyam, they can eat yam. I was speaking to you as well. That Nigeria is the largest producer of cassava, yet we import starch. Or the largest producer of yam. But all the derivatives of yam, cocoyam, and all that, we're not getting traction. You know why? Because, you see, I will say this unequivocally, and having practiced agriculture for close to 9 to 10 years, that we will never have a food crisis, in quotes. You know why? Because, you see, Nigeria produces so much that others you can switch. Our only problem is that what we produce, we do not have adequate storage for. So between 50 and 60% of it is lost due to facts inadequate storage. So that's a problem. So we will not have a crisis, a food crisis, but we will have crisis in some areas. For example, right now, there's bumper harvest for cocoyam, for yam, for cassava, and the likes. But what we need to do is to add something to it. You don't just have this raw what I would call tier 1 crops, cocoa, cashew, sesame, and the likes. Add value to it. Because when we don't add value to it, you make yourself very vulnerable, because you take this out, it gets produced or processed, and it's brought back to you. Like in case of petrol. Petroleum producers have become an albatross. So I'm telling people that if we're not very careful, these are 200 million population we'll talk about, and we tend to mouth. We might become an albatross for us.
Now, we currently produce, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's about 57% of the rice that we consume.
Yes.
And obviously that can be a lot higher, and that's the aim that we're aiming for. Now, I'd like you to speak on something that's often controversially argued, which is the claim that the ban on NPK may also contribute to the lower levels of production in rice. And then after that, what I'd like to bring in here is also the skew in the gender ratio when it comes into the agri-industry, because you see that 75% of farmers are women, yet over 75% of top-end processors are men. So what you see is a situation where women are not included in more advanced parts of the agri-value chain, and that, of course, poses a serious problem. So how are companies like Olam trying to put in schemes, or do companies like Olam have existing schemes to encourage more women at other levels or higher levels of the agri-value chain? But let's start with NPK.
NPK, for those who don't know, it's fertilizer we use for various crops. And it's important as well to situate the NPK on the basis of, I'm sure some time ago, the National Security Advisor, I think they banned NPK it was said that the nitrogen was being used for, fusing bombs or something along those lines. So there was a ban on it. Again, fertilizer mix is not what you usually have. People always talk about 15, 15, 15, but you need to do a proper soil test for you to know the kind of fertilizer what you need to use for the soil. But right now, we have a lot of fertilizer blending plants in Nigeria. I think we have an agreement with the Kingdom of Morocco. Morocco, by the way, is the largest producer of phosphate in the world. Phosphate is a major component of fertilizer mix. So for me, I don't think that's the issue. You see, we always like to skirt around issues that are not very important. We just need to properly plan, and plan holistically and long-term. We're very short-term in Nigeria, in everything we do, which is why we don't have long-term development plans, which we used to have in the 70s and 80s. What we are right now are plans of 4 years, 5 years. That won't help us. For our rice to get traction and to be able to get to the promised land, we need to plan 7 to 10 years. So it's important for the CBN to have a roundtable with rice processors, millers, and everybody in the rice value chain on that discussion, and on the commodity value chain generally. You spoke about Olam and about what we're doing for women. I don't want to talk about women. I don't want to talk about women, and I don't want to talk about this in a manner of speak as a kind of offering tokenism. It's not tokenism. Look at us in cashew, for example. We have nothing less than 2,000 women working in Kwara State, Ilorin to be precise, peeling cashew. You know why? They're more patient. The men do it in a hurry. And before you know it, you find out that the cashew you're processing and you're trying to process, you find out that when it comes out, you look at it and you say to yourself, oops, this is not good for export. But the women they're patient, they take their time, and we said to ourselves, let's just go organize these women into cooperatives and have them in the value chain. But you see, not coming to the value chain is not because we don't want them in the value chain. It's just because there are not many of them who organize themselves into cooperatives to come into the value chain. Even though people must understand that if you look at the population census, there are more women than men in Nigeria. I think it's probably skewed to the 51-49. So I agree with you that we should have more inclusion. And I'm one for inclusive prosperity. Inclusive prosperity brings everyone to the table happy. And we'll probably talk about a very secured, nation, food security-wise. And I think that's might be a way to end it from my end. Unless, of course, you have more questions for me.
Anyway, no, we'll still have some time with you, but we'll go on a short break, shortly. But before we go, let me give you another question to think about, and when we return, you address the question. I like the point you made about value chain, the agricultural value chain, and the fact that you've brought other products into the conversation. But you said something. You said Nigeria will never have a food crisis. Now, that's like echoing the minister, Minister of Agriculture, who says there's no hunger in Nigeria, or the president who says, we're self-sufficient in terms of food production. Are you saying the same thing? And then about storage. I mean, what is the politics about silos in Nigeria? Because we don't seem to have, a lot going for us in that regard. We'll take a short break. When we return, this conversation with Ade Adefeko will continue. Welcome back to the morning show here on the Arise News channel. Still with us in our studio is Ade Adefeko, Chairman of the Agribusiness Trade Group of NASIMA and Vice Chairman, Corporate and Government Relations of Olam Nigeria Limited. Ade, before we went on that short break, I asked you a question about whether or not there is hunger in the land, about whether there will be a food crisis at any time, whether indeed we're self-sufficient in terms of food production, and then the agricultural value chain, and about storage. Because in 2012, with Akinwumi Adesina as Minister of Agriculture, he's now with the African Development Bank, when we had flood in about 29 states. I mean, and there was this fear that there would be famine, in the country. We just fell back on the silos. But I don't know what the state of the silos is now, and you should know, because you are in the business.
It's important to state, and I want to state unequivocally that during that crisis, then we had what you call a national strategic grain reserve. So when we had the crisis on the floods, which impacted almost 22 states, and that was because of the dams, the floodplains. Talking about from Cameroon, from Niger, right now there's a particular river in Cameroon called River Lagdo, which has overflowed the banks again. and I mean, done some damage to some, but again, the quantum and the level is not as much, was not as high as then. Right now, as I speak, I was made to understand that there were some concessions, silo concessions. Well, I haven't benefited from it, so I cannot speak to it. But again, it's important to have a national strategic grain reserve, or what you call, this happens in every climate, particularly in developed countries. The Americans have it. So when there's a dearth of production, you release that to stabilize prices. But we don't have that right now. But what I was speaking to when I was talking about the fact that we will not have a food crisis is that people can always switch their palates to other crops and eat. There's no talking about hunger in the land. Hunger in the land, I think it's too simplistic to say there's no hunger in the land. Because, I mean, let's be frank with ourselves. What stares you in the face every day is people who are hungry, okay? But they're hungry not because of, in quotes, that lack of food, but it's just lack of organization of how will I put it, of our resources to cater for the needs of these people, which brings me to the subnationals. The subnationals must come into this conversation because they're responsible for their respective states. Everybody tends to blame the federal government for everything. And that's because every time the governors go, or the commissioners go to Abuja to get their national, what's that thing called? The monthly allocation. A monthly allocation, So, but you know what? States must be in charge of their own destiny by looking at the areas where they have comparative advantage. You can only be competitive where you have comparative advantage. Nigeria was the largest producer of cocoa prior to now. But right now, we're a distant third. Sometimes we're actually oscillating between third and fourth, between us and Cameroon. Guess what that fourth position is? It's 250,000 tons. You know the largest producer of cocoa in the world? It's Cote d'Ivoire, almost 2 million tons. You know the second largest producer? It's Ghana, which is between 750,000 and 1 million tons. Nigeria is a distant third, 250,000. And we've been at 250,000 for a very long time. Why is that? Because we have aging cocoa farmers who are on the 7th floor, and some of them even on the 8th floor, okay? And are still using old implements. And it takes a long time for cocoa trees, to bloom. So we cannot have production in Nigeria, capacity-wise, if you don't have the cocoa to put in. And we need to have a national cocoa policy that encourages people, kids from school, to begin to grow on Nigerian cocoa drinks. So what we're talking about here is from farm to fork, from seed to shelf, the entire value chain. So you have cocoa, you have cocoa beans, you have cocoa chocolates, you have cocoa drinks, and that whole value chain. But it's important to always talk about the fact that you can only play where you want to play. You cannot force a man to play in the entire value chain. But you must make sure that you support the entire value chain with structures that are not only long-term, but that structures that support the growth of it. Look at cashew, for example. What did Cote d'Ivoire do? We are a significant producer of cashew. Olam exports cashew, cocoa, sesame, and cotton. But you know what? Cote d'Ivoire looked at it. I mean, Alassane Ouattara is president of Cote d'Ivoire, but he's an economist. He used to be with World Bank or IMF, I'm not quite sure. So he knows his onions. And he said, you know what? I don't have a problem. You want me to export cocoa? Because people were taking cashew out of Cote d'Ivoire and taking to Vietnam and India to process. So you know what he did? He imposed what you call a cashew levy. So the cashew levy was a disincentive for you to send it abroad. So everybody started opening up cashew processing plants in Cote d'Ivoire. At that point in time, it didn't make any sense, economic sense, to take your cashew out to Vietnam and India. That Nigeria has done as well through what you call the Export Expansion Grant, but that's another conversation entirely. We need to help production, and we need to subsidize to an extent production. Because you see, the variables in Nigeria are not the same variables you have in Cote d'Ivoire, for example. Cote d'Ivoire doesn't suffer supply cuts in terms of power. They don't have inefficiencies in terms of oil and gas, okay? Infrastructure to a large extent is barely stable, even for a country that has gone to war and back. They've been on the brink and they're back. But you know what? They've looked at themselves and said to themselves, agriculture is our mainstay. Let's stick to it. And let's do what we call value chain, value chain optimization. Nigeria is not doing enough of value chain optimization. We mouth it, but we don't do it. So there's not enough to talk about what you want to do. You see, you have to walk the talk. We don't walk the talk. And that explains why we seem to be laggards, okay, unfortunately. So everything we've spoken to, we have comparative advantage in it. But you see, pick 2 or 3 crops and declare a national emergency if you have to, which is why I think we should have a conversation around agri-commodities, okay, as a whole. Probably have 10 of them and choose top 3 or top 4 that gives you comparative
Well,
advantage.
the CBN governor already listed 10.
Yes.
Yes, and which the CBN is supporting. You
Yes.
think that's not enough?
I know it is enough, but you see, you have to have the players come together. It's not enough to say you're supporting them. Who are you speaking to in the industry? If you're not speaking to the major players in the industry, who will help you ramp up? Because what is important is economies of scale. With due respect, outgrowers, smallholder farmers, the likes of me give smallholder farmers, allow the smallholder farmers to play. Because you know what? I off-take from them. And for me, I've talked about inclusive prosperity. There's no point me being a large behemoth in a country of 200 million people and the farmers who grow for me are impoverished. So it's important for me for them to be able to say, you know what, Olam has taken the bulk of my produce and has given me the right price. And the right price is very determinable because we have commodities exchanges all over the world. Technology has come in. Leila was speaking to bringing technology to enable. I mean, you can have 5 hectares of land, and the production from it will be so optimal and so efficient that somebody who has 100 or 200 hectares would not be able to produce that because of technology, okay? Because of technology, irrigation, greenhouse farming, smart practices, and all that. So it's important for us to key into that 4th industrial revolution because, like I said before, the train will leave us behind. But again, let's not cast aspersions too much on, because when we talk about, I'm one who believes that we should have a collaboration, a dialogue. Half of the time, we usually having what we call monologues. And you know, it's like winking at a lady in the dark. She won't see you.
Really? Tell me about that.
I like the fact that you spoke on value chain optimization because at the end of the day, that's where we're lacking behind right now. And it's important that key players do come together to contribute to this. Let's speak about the government's role in that.
Yes.
How much is the government really doing, not just the federal government, but state governments too, like you mentioned, to really support this value chain that we're speaking of? I know that there are schemes like the anchored borrower scheme that the CBN have, for example, etc. But in real terms, how much support really comes out of the government and how much are they really showing interest in that 4th industrial revolution that we speak of?
I think government is showing interest, but government's interest in it is on an interest Richter scale. Forgive me if I use that word, because the Richter scale is often used for earthquakes, but I tend to bring such into my language. So on the interest Richter scale, it's probably 3 or 4. They need to ramp that up to about 7 or 8%. Because you know what? Like I said, the subnationals need to take charge. They know what is in their states, which is why I have taken my investment to states like Kaduna, Ogun, Kwara, and the likes. Because for us, last time I checked, capital is mobile. And there's no patient capital anymore. You know, people always talk about return on investment, but we need to be very, very careful. We want return on investment, not return on egos. What we're managing in Nigeria, to a large extent, is egos. People who have large egos and start telling you what they think should happen or how big Nigeria is, how large we are, how we have potential. Ruben and I were speaking offset of how we've been talking about potential for the last 40 years of our lives. Am I right or wrong? We always talk about realizing our potential. When do we want to get there? I mean, it's akin to the man who's, is he a felon yet?
Who's that?
R. Kelly, who says, see you when you get there. So I hope
He was convicted.
He was convicted, so he's a felon, right?
Well,
Okay. I'm not a lawyer, so I need to be very, very...
he's been convicted.
He's been convicted. So see you when you get
He
there.
has another case next year.
Exactly. So, it's a question of his song which says, I'll see you when you get there. I mean, I'm asking myself, when will we get there?
Well, I mean, in your position, you must have been engaging with a lot of stakeholders.
Yes.
Government, you are even in charge of government relations.
Yes.
So that means both at the federal level and the state level.
And even at the local government.
And at the local government level. What have you seen in terms of the politics in the agri sector and the responsiveness, to investment offers by those who are supposed to take the decisions?
You see, what you have to understand again is that, to a large extent, states are constrained sometimes because of the fact that we always talk about some items being on the concurrent list and all that. So you need to understand the federation. And there's sometimes some constraints where some things limit you, for example. I mean, tell me, a state cannot, in code, establish a port, per se, because a port is on that list, the federal list, which is why, exclusive list, which is why you find to a large extent that we have only 1 or 2 ports. And you see these ports you have, I mean, I was speaking to the fact that for Nigeria, who exports, and for me, I'm the largest exporter to Nigeria after oil and gas. I export to in the neighborhood of about $300 to $400 million worth of products outside. And you find out that it takes 7 days from my office in Igomu to the port.
7 days?
Yeah, 7 days. That's
Igomu?
That's when we had that whole...
Igomu, where the National Theatre is.
When we had that whole
to the port.
Yes, when we had that whole problem of, waiting to take your exports. That same 7 days is how much time it takes to take a container from our port to Las Palmas in Spain. That's a tragedy of our nation. But right now, things have improved because there was a task force that has addressed that. So what I'm basically telling you is that these internal inefficiencies that are sometimes brought about by our own, I don't know, for lack of a better word, incongruities. So for me, I engage the federal, the state, and to a large extent, they are listening, but they can do more. And you don't have to listen only to the large ones, okay? But let's have an admixture of the large ones and representatives of the small ones, because the small ones, you need to know that they're the ones at the lower end, and they relate more with those, at the lower tier. So, but for me, I think government can do more. They are trying, but they can do more. And government should be enablers. Government has no business in business. I don't see any reason why government should be owning a silo. Government should concession out silos to people or to companies that have a proven track record. I am owned by Temasek, which is Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore. I'm 30 years old, but I started in Nigeria. I started in Nigeria 30 years ago, here in Nigeria. So it's in Nigeria. It's technically speaking, a company born in Nigeria and believing in Nigeria. I'm sure you recently heard about our acquisition of Dangote Flour. Prior to Dangote Flour acquisition, which was about 120 billion naira, we had acquired Boa, pasta and flour as well. And prior to then, we had acquired Crown Flour Mills. So for us, we look at these things we look at the economies of scale, we look at ramping up, we look at the consumer patterns and saying to ourselves, there's no point having to import these things because we save ourselves foreign exchange, okay, rather than having to import this. And again, that's one issue I'd like to speak to, which you've not asked me, but I think I need to speak to, is the ACFTA.
Oh, yes.
It's a very, very important thing.
Yeah, yes.
We came late to the party, but it's better late than never. I'm not a lawyer, but I was part of, the initial, the late Ambassador Chiedu.
Yes, the head of the Trade Facilitation Office.
Yes. He did a lot of work in negotiating over close to 300 or 400 treaties Nigeria went into, blindsided. Okay, and we came up with this ACFTA, and he said, listen, we are better off on the table. You cannot, it's the late Abiola that said, and I quote, you cannot shave a man's head in his absence. He has to put his head down. And 1.2 billion people, Nigeria is 200 million. We need to do it. Yes. And we have done it now, and we have issues of domestication or ratification. We can address that.
Thank you, Ade Adefeko. We could spend another 30 minutes on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but we thank you for the much that you have said so far.
Thank you very much.